The dead were sealed away. That was God's law. But there was a witch who wasn't meant to be. The king had outlawed her kind, mediums and necromancers. He swore they were gone. They made it punishable by death. But she remained, performing the rites no one else would touch. Then the same king who condemned her came in secret, asking for a voice from the other side. She called out, and something answered. God had closed the door, but she found the key. If you too perform rites no one else will touch, check out Pantheon, our brand inspired by myths, legends and folklore. We ship worldwide and are rated excellent on Trustpilot. Link in the description. She appears once, only once, in the biblical record. Just a role, a woman with a familiar spirit at Endor. The Hebrew Bible calls her Ba'alat Ov, a woman who consults ghosts, spirits, and the ritual object or act by which the dead were summoned. A recognized category. The ancient world understood what she was. A necromancer. A woman who performed the rite of calling the dead, and in the world she lived in, that role had history. Before Israel's priesthood was formalized, before temples replaced shrines and prophets were canonized, people still buried their dead. They still grieved, and when the pain of loss demanded an answer, not everyone turned to God. Many turned inward to memory, ritual, or hope that the silence could be broken. Across the ancient Near East, speaking to the dead was integrated. Babylonian texts describe offerings left at household tombs. Egyptian and Canaanite traditions had prayers for summoning ancestral voices. In early Israelite homes, before strict monotheism took hold, it was likely no different. The dead were still part of the household. They weren't entirely gone. Women were often the keepers of that connection. They led the mourning rites, remembered genealogies, carried burial knowledge. Some crossed into something more. These were the mediums, trained or perhaps born into the role of speaking to what others couldn't see. People knew who they were, knew where to find them, feared perhaps, but never fully erased. The woman at Endor belonged to that world. She would have learned her craft from another woman, through instruction, demonstration, and repetition. Her practice was older than scripture, a private form of knowledge passed from hand to hand, voice to voice, hidden but alive. Her work was procedural. We don't know the exact form, but the ancient sources suggest it might have involved invocation by name, preparation of the space, use of grave dust or ashes, and altered vocalization meant to pierce a sealed boundary. She didn't command spirits. That kind of arrogance belonged to kings and gods. Her role was to call, and to endure whatever came through. She was feared because she touched what no one else dared to. People came to her quietly, always with a reason and a name. They wanted contact, a final message, a chance to ask why, to say what was left unsaid. Though the law called her defiled, though the priests would have condemned her, though the written word would try to bury her, she was still there, at Endor, practicing the rites, keeping the old ways alive in a world that demanded they be forgotten. They kept doing what others pretended was gone. Saul was appointed, named a prophet, confirmed by instruction from above, and upheld by the belief that his authority flowed from something higher than himself. His task was to listen, to inquire, and to obey. As king, Saul had access to the recognized channels of divine communication. He could approach the prophet Samuel for direct counsel. He could seek interpretation through the priesthood using sacred tools, the Urim and Thummim, objects used to discern yes and no responses from God, and if no other answer came, he could turn inward and hope for a dream, a vision, or a sign in the night. These were understood to be real, direct, and binding. Then they stopped, just ceased. Samuel died, and no other prophet took his place. The priests fell silent, the Urim gave nothing, the dreams didn't come. Every voice Saul had once relied on, every means by which he sought the will of God, was suddenly quiet. At first he waited. That was the pattern. Ask, wait, receive. But no answer came, and in the silence something shifted. The absence of presence, just the void. For a man whose every step was once guided by the holy, that kind of silence is existential. He still wore the crown, but the foundation that made the crown meaningful had eroded beneath him. What good is rule without direction? What good is obedience when there are no more commands? He kept inquiring, he kept hoping, but once guaranteed responses had failed. He was alone. Dread of irrelevance. To act without God's voice was to risk disobedience. To refuse to act was to risk neglect. Either path could be wrong, but without instruction, even faith became a liability. And he still had a kingdom to govern, armies to lead, enemies pressing in, people watching, waiting, depending on him. But heaven was silent. The Philistines had always been Israel's enemy, a military convergence, disciplined, deliberate and final. They had crossed the ridgelines and assembled at Shunem, placing themselves above the Jezreel Valley. From that position they could cut Saul's kingdom in half. It was a staging ground for destruction. Saul saw the formation, he knew the terrain, he recognized what this was. The Philistines were coming to end him, and God still hadn't spoken. The silence that had once felt theological was now becoming tactical. There were decisions to make, urgent ones, where to position forces, where to draw the line, whether to commit his army to the valley or hold to the hills, but all of those decisions required one thing he no longer had, and the enemy was still coming. This is the part that matters. He was alone in a moment where no man was ever meant to stand alone. The war entered his perception, time felt unstable, decision became a danger. If he acted, he risked judgment. If he hesitated, he risked collapse. There was no safe move, no trusted voice. Only the increasing weight of consequences that had not yet been named but already felt permanent. This is what dread really is, the slow certainty that you've been left behind and that your role still demands action even as meaning falls away. He was trapped in a war he had to fight, with no assurance that fighting it was right. The Philistines had drawn their lines. They had terrain, numbers, momentum, and Saul only had silence. Saul knew exactly what he was doing. According to the law of Moses, consulting the dead was a capital offense. Deuteronomy 18:10-12 is explicit. Anyone who engages in necromancy, divination, or mediumship is detestable and is to be driven out. Leviticus 20:27 goes further. Those who have a familiar spirit are to be stoned. Saul had enforced this law himself. According to 1 Samuel 28:3, he had expelled every medium and necromancer from the land. It was one of the few acts of religious obedience he had carried out without delay or compromise. The calling of the dead was seen as direct rejection of authority and God. But when silence replaced revelation, Saul went looking for what had been forbidden. Endor was north of the Philistine lines, on the far side of Mount Moreh, meaning that to reach it, Saul would have to cross into enemy-controlled territory. It was not a short journey from his camp at Gilboa, and it was not a safe one. He took only 2 men and travelled by night. He wore no crown, no royal garments, no military insignia. He concealed his identity even from the woman he intended to speak to. Only quiet movement through hostile ground with no protection but darkness. This was an act of desperation. He was attempting to provoke God by reaching the one channel that had not yet gone silent. The hypocrisy was absolute. Saul had once destroyed this practice publicly, declaring it an abomination, a spiritual corruption that had to be purged. Now he was seeking it out in secret, hoping that the same ritual he once condemned might produce the certainty he no longer had. But the war was coming. The silence hadn't lifted, and he had run out of options. He was acting from fear. Fear of battle with no guidance, fear of a kingdom slipping from his grasp, and above all, fear that God's absence was permanent. And so, alone, veiled, and hunted by silence he could no longer endure, Saul entered Endor as a man crossing into a territory he had once marked as forbidden, standing before a woman whose existence he had tried to erase. She shouldn't have been there, but she was. She does not recognize him, and that matters more than anything else in this encounter. The danger in front of her is the uncertainty of the man making it. He speaks carefully, choosing words that reveal nothing about who he is or what he carries into her house. He asks for access, a specific kind of access, the kind that requires a name. That detail immediately changes the nature of the work. Most of those who came to her in the past wanted contact in the abstract, a husband, a child, a parent, someone unresolved, someone private. This request is precise and controlled and directed. He already knows who he wants to reach, but he refuses to say who it is. She understands what that means. A client who hides his identity while asking for a targeted summoning is protecting the consequences that follow him. Whatever he is carrying into the ritual doesn't belong only to him. It reaches outward. This is why she stops him. It is not just his caution that unsettles her, it's the weight beneath it, the clipped speech, the way others defer to him without speaking, the way he stands slightly apart as someone accustomed to being watched. There's something rehearsed in his restraint, something military in the silence. She has seen that before. Not often, but enough. She begins to suspect. When she names Saul aloud, it's a test, a deliberate incision. If her instinct is wrong, he will deny it without hesitation. If she's right, his body will answer before his mouth does. And it does. His breath catches, his posture shifts, his eyes harden in calculation. He says nothing, but something inside him narrows. She sees it immediately, and that is the moment she knows. The silence is confirmation enough. The disguise has slipped. There is only one man in Israel who could order a ban like the one he just broke. Only one man who could enter her home with that kind of hidden authority and still ask her to perform a ritual that could cost both of them their lives. She knows now, and knowing changes everything. It is political risk, the kind that doesn't end when the ritual ends. A summoning performed for a private citizen disappears into the dark with the person who asked for it. A summoning performed for a ruler carries consequences that extend far beyond the space it happens in. It becomes part of the machinery of power, part of a decision already in motion. She understands something else as well. If this is who she thinks it is, then the ritual will be used to author a course of action, which is not how her work was meant to function. She was trained to open a channel, not to steer history. This is where her hesitation truly sits, between participation and responsibility. If she refuses, she preserves her life for one more night. If she agrees, she becomes a hinge point in something far larger than herself. A private practice becomes a public consequence. Her hands become the point through which authority moves again. It freezes her, and yet she can see what stands in front of her. He isn't arrogant, threatening, nor bargaining. He's containing himself. Every word is measured, every movement restrained. Whatever certainty once held him in place has already collapsed. He's asking her because every other door has already failed him. People who come seeking spectacle are dangerous. People who come seeking necessity are worse. She recognizes that kind of desperation. She's watched it pass through her work for years. The moment when belief no longer sustains a person and only outcome remains. She understands that if she opens the channel for him, she won't be controlling what enters the room. The emotional state of the one who requests a summoning matters. Fear shapes what follows, authority shapes what follows, expectation shapes what follows. This man carries all three. Still, she agrees. She knows what it means when someone reaches the point where the dead become the only remaining voice. She grants it because refusal would change nothing about what has already begun to move, and so she prepares the space without the knowledge of whose future she is about to open. Every moment serves a function. Every gesture carries intention, refined over years of cautious repetition, years spent performing the forbidden under the threat of annihilation. She keeps her voice low, controlled. The language of spirits responds to tone, to cadence and precision. A single misplaced syllable, a shift in emphasis can fracture the line between this world and the next. Necromancy, in her hands, is calibration. Emotion must be checked. Focus must be sharpened. The veil between the living and the dead, it opens only under the right pressure, and even then, only briefly. The purpose is contact, reach. Anything beyond that is interference, and interference is where danger lives. She sets the circle, anchoring the ritual with care. The dead don't respond to speech alone. They move toward memory, toward loss, toward the invisible threads that bind them into the world they left behind. Grief is usually what opens a door, and grief is what calls them, but tonight, the thread is severed. What he brings is rupture, something broken within him is pressing into the space already. Even before she finishes the opening words, it distorts the air around him. He names the one he wants, Samuel. The name lands heavily. A prophet, a judge, a servant of the divine, once bound to the same structures that this man has torn apart. Samuel is not a spirit easily called. He does not return to satisfy longing. He returns only when summoned by force or by failure. The circle strains, the air around it begins to resist her authority. She has felt spiritual turbulence before, unsettled, dead, angry dead, even malicious dead. But this is different. It arrives with purpose. Something is stepping across the threshold because it has been pulled not by her, but by something else entirely. She tries to hold the boundary, but it's too late. The ritual begins to bend, warping around the presence that now enters without restraint. She cries out in recognition. The veil, it opens, and something passes through with full intent. Samuel has come. She sees Saul again, the king, the outlaw of her craft, the source of the purge, the one who severed the nation from its oracles and buried the sacred alongside the condemned. She always knew who he was, but now, in the presence of what he has dared to summon, all illusions collapse. This moment is no longer hers. The ritual has escaped its parameters. The dead have arrived, and something larger demanded an answer. Saul tried to manufacture what he once destroyed, to pull back what he silenced, and now the voice he seeks has answered with more force than he expected. This isn't necromancy, not anymore. This is reckoning, and she is standing in its path. Samuel speaks into the space she opened, and the tone of the voice carries none of the softness Saul once knew. "Why have you disturbed me by bringing me up?" the figure says. And the question itself already carries judgment, because disturbance is violation, crossing into a domain Saul had already been warned never to touch. The words that follow strip away the last remaining hope that had kept him upright through the silence. "The Lord has turned from you and become your enemy," the voice tells him. "The Lord has done to you as he spoke by me, for the Lord has torn the kingdom out of your hand and given it to your neighbor, to David." The language offers no mitigation and no theological distance. The kingship is torn away, removed. Saul had already been warned once before. In 1 Samuel 15, the Lord commanded him through Samuel to destroy the Amalekites completely, every man, woman, child, and animal. Total annihilation as retribution for what Amalek had done to Israel centuries earlier during the Exodus. But Saul disobeyed. He spared the Amalekite king, Agag, and kept the best of the livestock. When confronted, he justified it as an offering to God. Samuel's response was cold. Because you did not obey the voice of the Lord and did not carry out his fierce wrath against Amalek, therefore the Lord has done this thing to you this day. That act of disobedience was the moment Saul's kingdom began to fall. The silence of God, the absence of prophets, the need to summon the dead, it all traces back to this. Moreover, the Lord will give Israel also with you into the hand of the Philistines, and tomorrow you and your sons shall be with me. The word tomorrow collapses the entire future into a single remaining movement of time. It functions as closure. The outcome already exists, waiting only for the body to arrive. Then Saul fell at once, full length on the ground, filled with fear because of the words of Samuel. His body fails before any language can form. The authority that once held him upright disappears from his posture, and the crown he no longer wears still drops with him in that moment. The witch stays silent. There is nothing left for her to interpret. There is no remaining ambiguity to shape. The channel she has opened has already been overtaken by something that belongs to a different order entirely. For the first time since Saul crossed her threshold, she addressed him as a human being rather than as a client. She tells him to eat, tells him that his strength will fail him if he leaves the house in this state. Please, let your servant set a morsel of bread before you, and eat. Then you may have strength when you go on your way. It is the smallest act of care in the entire encounter, and it comes from the woman whose existence he once declared incompatible with life of the nation. He eats. The food restores enough physical stability to carry him back into the dark. It restores nothing else. Before dawn he leaves. The next day the war arrives exactly where it had gathered. The Philistines press their advantage across the slopes of Mount Gilboa, using the high ground they secured days earlier, forcing Israel's lines into retreat and fragmentation as the terrain collapses into narrow channels of flight. Saul's army breaks under sustained pressure. His sons remain in the front of the engagement, and they fall there. Jonathan dies first, then Abinadab, then Malchi-Shua. The narrative gives no speeches to mark their deaths. It only offers names and disappearance. The archers find Saul as the field continues to collapse around him. They severely wounded him, the text says alone. The wound itself matters less than what follows from it. Saul turns to the man who carries his armor and tells him to end it. The armor-bearer cannot bring himself to strike. Loyalty dissolves in the presence of proximity to death. So Saul takes the sword himself. Therefore Saul took his own sword and fell upon it. The king who once waited for instruction now acts without counsel. The man whose authority had always depended upon hearing from above completes his life inside the silence he had spent the night trying to escape. The battle moves on without him. The Philistines return the next day to the field. They find his body. They strip it. They remove the armor. They cut off his head. The king who ordered the removal of forbidden practitioners from the land now hangs in public view on a foreign wall, his body displayed as a political object and a theological statement at the same time. The judgment spoken in a hidden house during the night holds its shape in daylight, visible to soldiers, to civilians, to every surviving fragment of Israel's broken force. The witch. She vanishes. After the ritual, after the collapse of Saul, the woman the king sought in desperation simply disappears. The text doesn't record her fate. It doesn't need to. Her absence is the message. What passed through her wasn't supposed to touch anyone and remain clean. She was called the Baalat of, the mistress of spirits, a practitioner of necromancy, a channel to what should stay buried. She lived in hiding, survived the purge, and practiced in secret. She kept the boundary between the living and the dead functional, precise, and tightly controlled. Then Saul arrived and broke everything. He came with grief, yes, but it was grief twisted by power, by desperation. When he said the name Samuel, it was a command, a final act of authority from a king whose crown no longer held weight in the heaven, and the name tore open the veil. The witch didn't ask to become a vessel of divine wrath. She performed a ritual, just as she had likely done for others. But what came through was the voice of the divine, returning to finish what had already begun. That is why she vanishes. Not because she disobeyed, but because she succeeded. What God had sealed was breached, and she was the one who made it possible. In the biblical worldview, access is what provokes judgment. Prophets are anointed, priests are sanctified, but she was neither, and yet, through her hands, the king forced a reckoning that no one else could bring. She did what prophets couldn't, what priests weren't allowed to do. She opened the silence, and the voice came back. She becomes a symbol of something Israel was never comfortable admitting, that sacred power still moves outside authorized structures, that the divine might answer when spoken to by the wrong kind of person, and that no one, not kings, not priests, not prophets, can fully control what happens when you tear open the space between the worlds. She's never mentioned again. The system cannot process someone who shouldn't exist, but worked. She was the access, and the silence that followed her isn't peace. It's fear. Fear that the veil once broken might break again. The king is dead. The prophet has returned to earth, but the pit she dug is still there. Somewhere in the dark of Endor, the dirt is still loose, and the boundary is still thin. Because once you realize how to call the dead, you realize they never really stop answering. They just wait for the next voice to name them.